I'd like to introduce you this evening Professor Geertsema, Henk Geertsema, from the Faculty of Philosophy at Free University. Most of you know him, but not all. And most of you have already the opportunity last time to listen to some of his reflections concerning Dooyeweerd philosophy. Tonight he will give again a lecture for us. So I'm happy to introduce him, and I will give him immediately now the floor for the time till 9 o'clock. Not sharp, so you can be flexible, of course.
Well, thank you for the invitation to present the 3 introductory lectures in Dooyeweerd's philosophy again. I will follow the same order as the other time that I speak about the theory of the modal aspects tonight, or the theory of diversity and coherence in the modal sense. And then tomorrow night I will speak about the theory of entities, very structures, and on the Thursday it will be about what is usually called the transcendental critique. Could also call it the relation between faith and science. And if those titles don't mean anything to you yet, then just wait till I present my lecture, then I hope to explain them. Dooyeweerd's philosophy probably has become most well known by his theory of the modal aspects. And I will, as an introduction, just tell something about some remarks and then be more specific in certain characteristics later on. I don't think it's necessary to enumerate them, in Dooyeweerd's analysis, the 15 aspects which he distinguishes. I saw in your presentations that they are mentioned in the proceedings already, and so it seems not worthwhile to spend time in mentioning all the 15, or as I saw in some presentations, the 16 or 17 even. As such, the number is not that important. It always is presented by Dooyeweerd as a provisional analysis. In his analysis, he came to a conclusion of 15 aspects, but he was hoping that there would be more. I think what is important is that, although the number is not definite, the theory would really change if the number would be 250 different modal aspects. So there can be a range between, say, 10 or 20, and I don't mind if it is a little more or a little less. But if the number would be as large as 250, then the theory had to be changed, because then it would not be a basic framework to understand the diversity in reality anymore. The fruitfulness of this approach, I think, is that where in the common philosophical theories you either have a dualistic approach or a monistic approach. The dualistic approach in terms of, say, mind and matter, as the basic framework to distinguish the diversity in reality. And because the dualism of mind and matter confronts serious difficulties, and many people think today more in terms of a monism, and often that is naturalism or physicalism. That basically also mental phenomena are explained in terms of physical phenomena. I could get into that, but I won't, because the picture is of course more complicated than just reductionism. There are several kinds of reductionisms, but I do mention it because often the whole approach is still in terms of the dualism or the monism. If the mental phenomena can be reduced to material phenomena, or if they can't. Now the basic diversity that Dooyeweerd distinguishes with his 15 modal aspects should be compared with either the monistic physicalism or a dualism of mind and matter. And then it shows immediately that his framework of thinking is much more diverse than the approaches you often find in the discussions today. That's one remark, and then a remark that's connected with that is that this diversity in those 15 modal aspects is not just a matter of concepts, that there is a diversity of concepts that cannot be reduced to one another, but that that diversity has an ontological meaning. I will come back to that later. So that as the first remark, and then the second is kind of historical. This might be helpful in relation to the question, how did Dooyeweerd come to this theory, to his distinguishing those different modal aspects? In this respect, it's important to realize that Dooyeweerd was a student of law. And after he had finished his PhD degree, he was very much interested in the philosophy of law, in the foundations of his own field. So he started to study the philosophy of law in his own time. And he discovered that some people would base the concept of law in the concept of ethics, so that law basically is a moral concept. Others would explain it in terms of social relationships, so that would lead to a sociological explanation of law. Others again would take it as basically a logical concept, which was predominant in Neo-Kantianism of that time. But all those approaches did not satisfy Dooyeweerd, because he thought what is typical of law as such, which characterizes that concept, is not done justice to by those explanations. And that led him to the view that law, the concept of law, cannot be explained in concepts of another field, either logic or sociology or ethics or whatever. And so he came to the idea that the juridical is a field of its own, which cannot be explained in concepts of another field. And now with the other fields that were applied to explain law, of course he had some other aspects, fields, scientific fields already. And then he was looking onwards, and then gradually his theory developed that first 14 of those irreducible aspects in the reality that should be distinguished later on. He analyzed 15. So what is typical for this approach is how can we do justice to the diversity in the reality and characterize that diversity as a basic diversity. What is typical for specific fields, and then the next thing is, and I come back to that later, what is the coherence within that diversity. Now it's interesting that some years ago, kind of a similar thing was done by a Finnish philosopher, Tapio Vuorimatka, who wrote a PhD dissertation at the university in Finland about moral, it's called modal realism and justification. And in a discussion with contemporary moral philosophy, he argued that to understand the field of morality, also you have to accept that there is a basic mode of experience, a basic aspect of reality, which is the moral aspect, that cannot be explained in other terms again, that cannot be founded in something else again. It's in that sense, an original field. It has its own basic concepts that cannot be explained in more basic ones. I think to understand Dooyeweerd theory, it's important that it's not just developed behind his desk, thinking about the diversity in reality in a very abstract way, but it was developed in relation to typical problems of philosophy of law, as he was finding that in his own time. So it's a theory to account for a basic diversity in reality and to account for the basic concepts that we use to get some insight in the diversity of reality. One criterion, I will mention some others later on, but one criterion for such a basic aspect is that if you don't distinguish it, it will lead to antinomies. That if you try to reduce one concept to another, where there is not that relationship, there will arise contradictions. And one example, sometimes you find statements that still lead in that direction, I think, but I'm not using it as a position that's really defended, but just as an illustration. The statement or the explanation of consciousness as a physical phenomenon, basically, with then the addition that consciousness as such is an illusion, because it's just a physical notion. It can be explained in terms of matter. And then the separate concept of consciousness as something existing in itself would be an illusion. Now the contradiction or the antinomy is here that the term illusion presupposes the field of consciousness. The term illusion does not have any meaning in the physical field. You don't find illusions there. Of course, you can find illusions in the study of physical phenomena, but it's not a physical term as such. So if you say that consciousness is an illusion, you use a concept that presupposes consciousness to explain it away. And there, you could say, there is the contradiction. You're trying to reduce a mental phenomenon, say, in Dooyeweerd's terminology, the psychic aspect in terms of physics, and that leads to an antinomy, because you are using already non-physical concepts to explain the field of consciousness. That as a first introduction of the different modal aspects as they are part of Dooyeweerd theory. I come to the second aspect of the theory, and I start with the way Dooyeweerd calls them. He calls them by different names, and I used already different names up till now. He calls them aspects of reality, which of course is rather general. He calls them modes of being, or modalities. And related to that is that he calls them functions of things. But what I'm saying now is not exactly the case, because Dooyeweerd would say that concrete things have functions in the different modes of being, or in the different modal aspects. So functions are basically aspects of things, where Dooyeweerd uses the terms of modal aspects or modes of being in a more basic sense. As a structural framework in which we understand reality, but that has ontological meaning in itself, although he wouldn't say that it exists apart from the concrete things. But they are modes of being that make those things possible. One thing in this respect is important, and that aspects, modal aspects in Dooyeweerd philosophy, should be clearly distinguished from concrete things. They are abstract modes of being, and concrete things are related to them, presupposed in Dooyeweerd's philosophy. But the modal aspect is not something like a concrete thing. in that sense, it's a result of a theoretical analysis to come to the modal aspects as the way we have analyzed them. Until now, I call them with names that relate to things, modes of being, aspects. But Dooyeweerd uses another name too, and that is modes of experience, which is interesting, but because it relates being to experience or experience to being. There is some problem here if you can call all the modes of being modes of experience. I won't go into that question, but at least from the psychic aspect, sensation, perception, the modes of being are modes of experience. Let me use two illustrations to make this clear. One of the modal aspects in Dooyeweerd philosophy is the economic mode of being. And that, of course, refers to economic activities of human actors. But it would be impossible to have an economic act without economic notions, economic knowledge. So to relate to certain things in an economical way, there needs to be an economic experience of those things. So the economic aspect, economic mode of being is impossible without it being at the same time a mode of experience. The same is true for the legal aspect, the juridical mode of being. We could not act in a legal or illegal way. Of course, illegal is still legal, but in the sense that it's against the norm of legality, without an experience in a legal sense. That we experience another person in the sense that he has rights, or that there are certain rights about certain things. So the modes of being are at the same time modes of experience, which has as an implication, and I'll go back to that later, that a general opposition between reality at one side and the experience of reality at the other side, the knowing subject over against the known object, is kind of falling away in this approach. Because the modes of being, as modes of experience, they relate the knowing subject and the knowing object. But as I said, I come back to that later. Another characteristic of these aspects, these modes of being, is that they apply in principle universally. That means that all things potentially function in all aspects. You can count them, they have a spatial side to them, the aspect of movement, mechanical aspect applies, and so all the aspects. And then of course the question immediately comes up, how is that possible? Because a tree clearly has a numerical aspect, it has a spatial aspect, it has a physical aspect, it has a biotic or biological aspect, but a tree has no sensations as far as we know. A tree doesn't speak in the literal sense. A tree is not an economic subject. Well, to maintain the idea that the aspects in principle apply universally, Dooyeweerd needs the distinction between subjective functions and objective functions. You could also call them active functions or passive functions. A tree does not perceive, does not speak, does not act economically. But a tree can be perceived, that can be spoken about. It can be part of an economic transaction, which illustrates clearly that the economic, the lingual, and the perceptional or the psychological apply to a tree, but in a different sense than they apply to a human person. They apply to a tree in a passive, in an objective sense, not in a subjective sense. Now, one reason why that universal nature of the modes of being is so important is that they show all kinds of coherence in the reality. And to explain that, let me add one thing about the modes of being, that they not only imply specific concepts that cannot be explained in terms of one another, they are also characterized by specific laws that cannot be explained in terms of one another or deduced from one another. Mathematical laws, physical laws, the laws of biology, psychology. The term law is used in a wide sense here. Whatever philosophical view you have about laws, that's a matter I leave aside. But for Dooyeweerd, the regularities, the order in the reality is not just a matter of our understanding, but there is a given order that can be explained, understood in terms of laws that we discover and that we try to formulate. Now, if you take the example of the laws of physics make within physics relationships possible. The cause and effect relationship is possible on the basis of certain laws that apply. We can play billiard and transmit certain energy from one ball to another because certain mechanical laws apply. So laws constitute coherence. They make relationships, interaction possible between subjects in a specific area. That applies to biology, that applies to psychology, that applies to economics, that applies to the field of law. Also, to give that illustration, in the field of law, people interact in a legal way, as legal subjects in relation to one another, because of certain legal rules apply. So the laws of the modes of being, they constitute coherences, relationships. But that not only applies to the subject-subject relationships, things that function in a mode of being as a subject, as humans in the area of law, but it also applies in the subject-object relationship. Also, those relationships constitute a certain coherence. In relation to economics, we are not surprised that many objects can be taken to the market and be sold. That's an economic object. But that shows that there is a kind of coherence between the economic subject that sells and the economic object. There is also a certain relationship, a coherence. Now, the economic object, say an animal or something physical, does not function immediately according to economic laws, only in an indirect way via the economic subjects. But still it functions in an economic sense. So also the subject-object relationship, the economic subject, the economic object, or the object that we perceive and the subject that perceives, that constitutes a relationship of coherence in reality. So, a basic characteristic of the modal aspects, modes of being, modes of experience, is that they are relationships of coherence, that constitute coherence in reality. And that's on the basis of the laws that make specific activities acts possible. Now, let me draw some philosophical conclusions from this in relation to what is, although it is very much discussed today, is still rather common in contemporary philosophy, as far as it is a result of what is called Cartesian thinking. In the Cartesian way of thinking, the human subject, characterized as consciousness, is placed over against the object. There is an inner world of consciousness over against an outer world that is objective. And then, of course, what the attempt is to bridge that gap, and the result of bridging that gap is knowledge. You need to come from inside the consciousness to the outer object, the outer world, with all the different nuances that have been developed here. But the starting point is that there is kind of a gap between the inner world of the human mind and the outer world that then is taken as to be physical. I simplify, of course, the discussion, because there is also the other subject, the other mind problem, but I leave that aside. Now, typical for the Cartesian approach is that you have a gap, the inner world of the mind over against the outer world of matter. This dualism, it's basically a dualism, is traditionally indeed in terms of mind and matter. Today, some people try to bridge the gap by speaking in terms of language and an outer world, but then the problem arises again, how can language relate to the outer reality? And another characteristic of this approach is that only the human mind is subject over against the rest of reality as object. Now, if you compare this framework that is still pretty much determining the discussion, although many people try to overcome the Cartesian dualism in whatever way, but if you compare this framework with what I just sketched as the Dooyeweerd theory, then the first thing is that there is not a primary gap between the mental world and the material world, but there are relationships of coherence. It's not an over against, but there are several relationships of coherence. The second thing is that over against the dualism of mind and matter, there is a diversity of 14, 15, 16 different aspects. So the basic diversity in reality is much richer than that of mind and matter. And then another element is that there is not only the human subject, but in all the different aspects you find subjective functions. An animal can be a subject in the psychological aspect, it can be a subject in the physical aspect, a plant is a subject in the biotic aspect. So the whole terminology of subject and object that changes too. So it gives a rather different framework to approach reality than in the Cartesian approach. It's one implication of this theory over against the common framework in philosophy. A second one is in relation to the problem of realism, or in the Kantian terminology, the thing in itself. The question put very generally, is there a reality independent of the human mind? How far does the human mind shape reality? Well, Kant's problem of is there a thing in itself? At least he would say, in our theoretical knowledge, we do not know such a world. And that then leads to, in some way, to idealism. That question is still discussed. Is there a reality independent of the human mind, or is the reality that we know constructed by, shaped by the faculties of human knowledge? And then is reality in itself unknowable, or maybe it's not even there? Reality as such is a construction. Now I realize that here too I simplify matters, but still I would say that the problem changes in Dooyeweerd's approach. Because, and I come back to that in my lecture tomorrow night when I speak about entities, but take now the example of the tree that I used. The tree has certain aspects in which it functions as a subject, the numerical, the spatial, the mechanical, the physical, the biotic, and those aspects belong to the tree as such, you could say. You could even say this is the tree in itself, as it exists independent of the human mind. Although it doesn't exist without relations to man, because the human person also functions as a subject in those aspects, in the numerical, so there is still a coherence. It's not completely foreign, alien to the human person, but there is still a relationship. But then if the passive functions really belong to the tree, say as an economic object, as a legal object, then the integral existence of the tree is not independent of the human person. It's not independent of birds either, because trees exist in relationship to birds also. So the full picture of a tree implies relationships in which the tree exists with birds, with human persons, and of course with other trees. It does not exist in itself. It does exist in relationships. And you can distinguish between the subjects, the active functions, and the objective, the passive functions, but they are not some projection of the human mind on the tree, but to the integral existence of the tree, they are really a part of that. So it's kind of an abstraction to speak of a thing in itself. Then you abstract it from the relationships in which it exists. Which doesn't mean that then it becomes a construct of the human mind. It's not. It exists in relationships with several aspects. But the traditional approach in terms of realism or idealism, I think, does not really apply anymore. Dooyeweerd is not an idealist, but he is not a realist in a sense that things exist independently from the human person either, because that things exist in relationships is rather crucial. And this does not lead to a relativism in Dooyeweerd's approach, because what accounts for the constancy of things is the laws that hold for their existence. The specific laws that hold for the specific modes of being. So it doesn't mean that if things exist in relationships that it's just things determined by other things, no, because all those relationships are determined by certain laws that apply there. And the constancy, the stability, the reliability of reality is dependent on that relationship, not on some kind of independence, but that certain laws hold for them. Well, let me add one remark, and then I go to another side of Dooyeweerd theory. And sometimes, maybe often, the impression is given that with the theory of the modal aspects, the several modes of being, that we attempt an exhaustive analysis of reality. Of course, not of the whole diversity, there's a diversity of things that I will talk about in the second lecture, but that as far as there are modes of being, that our analysis is exhaustive. Even if it is provisional, it still tends to be exhaustive. Which would mean that if that analysis is applied to created reality as such, that with these 15 modes of being, we could in some way characterize all creatures that exist. And I think that would be too big a claim. There are certain experiences people have, say in the field of the occult, that you can think of the way in Christianity the Bible is spoken about angels too, that I don't think we can analyze in terms of those 15 modalities. And I don't think that we should try to do. We shouldn't try to add another modal aspect that then would apply to the specific nature of angels or demonic creatures, because I think that would go beyond what we can analyze theoretically. But that doesn't mean that that beyond does not exist. So I think we should not claim that this analysis is exhaustive. There might be other modes of being within this reality, God's creation, than the modes of being that we can analyze theoretically. It's interesting that from a very different background, the philosopher Thomas Nagel, in his book The View from Nowhere, which is certainly not a Dooyeweerdian view, that he explicitly mentions this same element as a limitation of our human knowledge. That doesn't mean that our human knowledge is not valid, but we cannot claim that it is exhaustive, that there is nothing in reality than what we can experience or can know theoretically. This, of course, is rather important because if there are other modes of being that we cannot analyze theoretically, and other creatures that still relate to the world that we do experience, then there might be influences in this world that we cannot account for in our theoretical system. And as long as we keep in mind that our theoretical systems are open systems, I think there is no problem with it. If we think in terms of it as a closed system, of course it's rather dangerous or risky for me to talk about systems in this meeting, because you know about it, I don't. But still, I think here also, if you approach the theory of the modes of being as a system, it should be seen as an open system and not as a closed system. Up till now, I talked about coherence constituted by those different modes of being between creatures that somehow are characterized by those modes of being. Now I will deal with another side, and that is the diversity and the coherence between the different modes of being. I emphasized already that a basic characteristic of those modes of being is their irreducibility. The physical cannot be reduced to the mathematical. The biotic cannot be reduced to the physical. Of course, stating is not arguing for it. I realize that. Stating it is easier than arguing it. And in a discussion we might talk about it. The basic argument, of course, is that there are certain concepts used in every field and certain laws that apply that cannot be reduced to other concepts or to other laws. I also mentioned already that this diversity of modes of being is not just conceptual, but it's ontological. It's not just epistemological, but it's ontological. The concepts refer to laws that are characteristic for reality as such. There's another side to it too that I think is important in this context, and that is that with this theory, Dooyeweerd tries to account for the qualitative diversity in reality. It's not just in a conceptual sense that we need concise concepts, but it also points to the richness of reality. The diversity in our human experience, in our human reality, the diversity in the quality we can experience there. It refers also to the difference in normativity. But it's not only a theory to explain and to give a framework, but I think it's also a theory that can make us sensitive to the diversity, to the richness that is there, so that even for practical life it can be helpful. That we realize that all those modes of experience, just because they are irreducible, that they have a mystery of their own, a mystery that we can experience, and in which a side of our human being, not just of our human being, but of all created being, can be explored, can become to disclosure, can be really experienced in its meaning. That's why Dooyeweerd calls the different aspects of also aspects of meaning. And in relation to the core that characterizes a certain aspect, he speaks of a nuclear meaning. And it's not meaning in the sense of language, but it's meaning in the deep sense that we experience something as meaningful. It has the quality in itself. Then there is, of course, another distinction necessary, and that's the distinction between, put it simply, the aspects of nature, natural aspects, and aspects wherein there is specific normativity. There are two ways we can characterize this distinction. The laws of the natural aspects, they hold anyway. We cannot transgress the law of gravity. Of course, we can misunderstand it or try to act against it, but it will still work. And we can use it. A moral norm we can transgress. A legal norm we can act against. And the norm of logic we can do too. So there is one difference. There is another difference which Dooyeweerd sees especially from or after the logical one, and that is that the laws that hold, now in a normative sense, are given only in principle. That means that we humans have to work them out. Legal norms have to be positivized. That means they have to be worked out in the legal system. There are certain principles, certain legal principles But a judge as such cannot appeal to a legal principle, he must appeal to the law of a state. That's positive law. Now, in some way, you can see the same thing in relation to laws of physics, where they are used in technical constructs, but still there, I think, is some difference. This was still about the diversity between the aspects, but there is also a coherence between the aspects. The theory of the modal aspects, the modes of being, does not split up reality in 15 parts without any coherence. In Dooyeweerd's view, and I will try to explain that in a moment, in Dooyeweerd's view, all the aspects, although they are irreducible, they also refer to one another. They depend on one another. Let me give some illustrations. In the first place, I'm not really a professional in this field, so maybe I do not formulate it in a precise way. But in the field of numbers, the first aspect, somehow there is already a reference to the field of space, the spatial aspect. For Dooyeweerd is a field, a mode that cannot be reduced to the numerical. And the illustration that is given here are the irrational numbers, like p in a circle, and the root 2, is that the right name in English? Those numbers, let me put it this way, they are discovered in relation to spatial figures. The proportions in the circle between the diameter and
the rate of the diameter.
And in the root 2 is in relation to another geometric figure.
To the triangle, you mean?
Yeah. Oh. So here the field of space is somehow necessary to understand typical numbers. And Dooyeweerd has worked it out, not in all details, but in this way, here he speaks of an anticipation, that the numerical aspect anticipates the spatial aspect. But in the same way, you can find illustrations that it anticipates the mechanical aspect, physical aspect, but also that in the later aspects, there are references back, what do we call retrospetions, to former aspects. In relation to space, he mentions a number of dimensions that is always there in space, and the number of dimensions refers back to the numerical aspect. So there is not only irreducibility, there is also coherence. Let me elaborate a little bit more on another illustration, which has also wider philosophical implications, and that's the cause-effect relationship. The cause-effect relationship is usually understood, and I think rightly so, as typical, at least in some sense, for the physical aspect. I don't know if this is precise in a physical sense, but you could say it's a transmission of energy, the cause-effect relationship. But maybe you can question that. But at least the cause-effect relationship applies to physical relationships. Now, in some fields, you also find explanations in terms of cause and effect. But then there are discussions how that is possible. In the field of history, for instance, is it possible to give cause-effect explanations in relation to certain historical phenomena? And again, I'm simplifying, schematizing. But one possible answer is yes, because that's the only way that we can explain certain historical developments, because there are causes, there are certain effects. causes that lead to certain consequences. But then others would say that if you explain historical events in such a way, that implies a deterministic view of history, because the cause determines the effect, and then the cause itself is determined as an effect by another cause, and that leads to a deterministic view of history. And because they won't accept a deterministic view of history, they reject that there is a cause-effect relationship in the historical field. Now, Dooyeweerd's solution to this problem is that indeed there is a cause-effect relationship in the historical field, but the cause-effect concepts here have a specific meaning. They have a historical meaning and not a physical meaning, which means that in a historical chain of cause and effect, there is always human choice, human responsibility, human freedom involved. You could say a cause elicits a certain effect, but you cannot say that it determines it in a physical way. So the cause-effect relationship does apply to historical events, relates them to one another, but not in a physical sense. The cause-effect concept has a historical meaning here. It refers to the cause-effect relationship in the physical field, but it's used in an analogical sense. It's not used in a physical sense, but it's used in an analogical sense. This approach of Dooyeweerd, Dooyeweerd has applied also to the field of law, and it's a problem of the philosopher of law also. Are there law causes and effect relationships in a legal sense? And there too the problem is, if you accept that, in what sense can you speak of that? And there too you need a distinction between a cause and effect relationship in a physical sense and in a legal sense. That's already three ways that the cause-effect relationship can be used: in a physical sense, in a historical sense, a legal sense. And basically I think that you can apply it to all the different modes of being, all the different aspects. If you relate the different aspects to specific sciences, scientific fields, I think as a heuristic method you could try to find the specific ways in which cause-effect relationships are taken in every field, not in a physical field apart from physics itself, but in a different way. In biology it has, I think, something to do with functional adaptation. In psychology it has to do something with intention. In logic it has something to do with the logical ground, and so you could go on. And the legal cause-effect relationship still is different from a moral cause-effect relationship. You can be morally responsible without being legally accountable. So there again you have a diversity, but at the same time there is a coherence. Although it has worked out, not for all the relationships, but how between the different aspects there are those elements that are part of the basic concepts of a scientific field, characterized by a field of being, that refer to concepts of another field, and that are used in an analogical way. Of course, this term analogical use was not discovered by Dooyeweerd. It's much older. But Dooyeweerd gives in his theory, I think, a fruitful theoretical framework to account for them. Let me conclude with a few remarks that relate to basically this last aspect, but more or less also to the whole of what I said thus far. With the analogies, the elements, basic concepts that refer back to earlier modes of being, or that refer forward to later aspects of being, there is a second criteria to distinguish the modes of being. Because within the whole theory, if you assume or propose a new aspect to be distinguished from all the others, basically you have to argue that the different analogical moments are there too. That in the other fields, the other modes of being, there are basic concepts that refer to that aspect, and in the aspect itself, there are those moments that refer to the others. So it gives a new theoretical criterion to check, to judge if you really speak about a mode of being comparable with the others, or that there is something else the case. The second remark, these analogical concepts also relate to the order between the aspects. The numerical aspect has no retrocitations referring back to earlier aspects, and the last aspect, for the mystical or the creedal, has no anticipations referring to later aspects. And so you can try to find the order in what is always presupposed in the mode of being, referring back to the earlier modes, and what is related to opening up, the whole theory of disclosure and opening up I leave aside, because that would require almost another lecture. But let me just put it this way. Dooyeweerd distinguishes, in relation to the modes of being, between a closed form and an opened up form. The closed form of a mode of being consists of the nuclear meaning and the elements that refer back to the earlier modes of being. You can't have a physical mode of being in reality without the mechanical, the spatial, and the numerical. But you can imagine a physical mode of being without the biological or without the economic. We cannot imagine the lingual mode of being without a numerical, a spatial, a mechanical, a physical. Think of the biological, of the way we speak, we make sounds. So, but you can imagine the mode of being, although in relation to the human aspects it's more difficult, but you could say you can imagine language which is not opened up already to the legal one, the legal aspect. So in terms of the aspects that are always presupposed, or aspects that come later, that are not presupposed, but that are part of and has to be opened up, you can make a distinction between, or you can try to state the order between the aspects. The order of the aspects also relates to the references between the different modes of being. Then my final remark, it is possible, and I think there is some danger there, that if a theory, modes of being, is so much refined, as I just developed with all those analogical concepts, that it becomes kind of a dogmatic system that somehow gets a life of its own and is just there to be developed as a system to fill in all the details of the system. I think there is a danger that it would be developed that way. I don't think that Dooyeweerd is doing it that way. He always has related his analysis of certain aspects to the sciences that dealt with those fields, and of course for that reason his own work is in some sense also dated, because he referred to the work of his time, and that is some years ago, to put it with an understatement. But there always has been that related to the empirical sciences, to the studies in the field. And there, I think it has to prove its fruitfulness. And as far as I can see, as a philosophical framework, it really has shown its fruitfulness. But again, it should be applied in relation to what is going on, and there it still has to prove that it's fruitful, and it should not be developed as a system in itself.
Thank you. So far, Mr. Geertsema. You have the opportunity now to raise questions, make remarks, or just what you like. Derek, perhaps.
Well, I have some questions, but should I start? Got no one else, so okay. Sorry. Yes,
You have one?
yeah, I have.
Okay.
A few, but this, you talked about modes of being and modes of experience, and it's a relationship, coherence. I had problems with following exactly. Is it the kind of relation between the being in ontological manner, fashion, and experience in epistemological fashion, or there's the subject-object relation? How does he consider it?
Well, the way I understand Dooyeweerd is that ontology and epistemology, in a traditional sense, cannot be kept separated here. And now, of course, Dooyeweerd is not talking about epistemology in the sense of the theory of knowledge. He's talking about our knowing in everyday life. It's not a theory of theoretical knowledge. It's a different topic in Dooyeweerd, and I didn't deal with that tonight. But what he would say is that as a framework of thinking about reality, we cannot start with the opposition of the knowing subject over against a known or to be known object. For Dooyeweerd, this is typical for a theoretical type of knowledge. In that sense, the Cartesian subject-object scheme for him is typical for theoretical knowledge. Not that there is a real gap there, but that there is somehow the logical that tries to conceptualize the field that is to be known. But in our everyday life, you cannot make a distinction between being and knowing or experiencing, because several modes of being include experiencing. Say, economic activities, the economic mode of being. Now, maybe we tend from the Cartesian way of thinking to think that the economic objects have the economic mode of being, and what is sold in the market, that's the economic way of being. But then, the first thing to say is that these things are only an economic object in relation to the human person as an economic subject. A tree in a forest where no human being has been is only potentially an economic object, but not actually. The economic object function is not opened up, is not actualized. So, even in relation to the economic object, the economic mode of being depends on economic subjects, and as far as we know, it's only the human being. But in an economic activity, in everyday life, we cannot perform economic activities without an economic mode of experience. There is always economic experience, experiencing things in the economic way, acting in the economic way. We cannot do that, we could say, without knowledge, without a certain notion of what it means to sell, to buy, of economic value. That's part of the mode of being. Say, in relation to the legal mode of being. If I would go to a courtroom to judge the whole situation, and I wouldn't have any understanding, any notion of legality, I couldn't understand what's happening there. But the same would be true if I didn't have any sense of legality. I could not perform legal actions. If I would have not any sense of legality, a judge would not hold me accountable for certain activity. So certain modes of being are modes of experience. Not that exhaustively they are modes of experience, but they cannot be separated from that. And so that's a rather different approach than from the Cartesian. Now, it's not that it's completely different from, say, the Greek view of being. There is a basic difference, but in another sense, you could say. In the Greek way of thinking, Plato and Aristotle, there was also a unity or a coherence between being and knowing. Because a real being was intelligent being or intelligible being. The highest being was a divine being, which Aristotle would call the highest intellect. And knowledge is possible because there is that intelligibility in reality. So in Greek philosophy, there also was the coherence between being and knowing. They were not separate in a Cartesian sense of the inner world over against the outer world, but they were integrated. But the problem there is that the intellectual or the logical is put over against the sensual and the material. So the diversity of modes of being, in the way that Dooyeweerd analyzed them, you won't find there either. But the Cartesian opposition is not the starting point in Greek philosophy either. So in that sense, there is an earlier tradition where Dooyeweerd could refer to. I don't know if he ever did in that sense. But in other philosophers nowadays, like Heidegger and Gada, you find a discussion in terms of Cartesian and Greek thinking in the same direction as I just mentioned. Although there you don't find the diversity of aspects in the sense of Dooyeweerd. I don't know if it is helpful or confusing.
Just a short comment after. Yeah, I think this dualism to epistemology is quite unlucky also. So if I would interpret it as we know what is being, there is no difference. We know what is around, and what is around is what we know. Is it meaningful in this aspect to talk about what we know and what is the being?
Well, I'm not identifying knowing and being, or experiencing and being. I'm not identifying them. In Greek philosophy, there in some there is identification of knowledge and being. Parmenides they started with that. That those are taken as absolute. But I'm not defending that kind of identification. What I'm saying is that a theory of reality, and for me that is created reality, we cannot just separate modes of being out against modes of knowing. But in a theory of reality, certain modes imply knowing, experiencing. To have an integral view of created reality, being and knowing cannot be kept separate. And to make a big jump, you could say this is very true in our daily life, because very much of the world around us is constructed on the basis of knowledge. A table as it is here would not be there if there was not knowledge. So in our actual life, almost everywhere, there is knowledge involved in the things that are there. And of course, this is a rather simplifying example. But it shows, I think, that in our daily experience, we do not make the abstraction of the things in itself apart from their relationship to us. Which does not mean that if we experience and know things in relationships, that we know them exhaustively, or that we cannot increase our knowledge. Of course, it's possible. If there is a relation between modes of being and modes of experience, that doesn't mean that even in those modes that our knowledge is exhaustive. It's just that the mode of experiencing is implied in the mode of being, say in legal activities. But it doesn't mean that it comes out of myself as a legal subject, what is legally there. In the sense that I know everything already, because there is that relationship between being and experiencing.
Oh, very well. My interpretation is just that in that way there is no real meaning in talking about reality in the ontic manner, because it will be, in speculative modal, or let's say in critical modality there will be a meaning, but otherwise there is no really perhaps meaning at all to talking.
Indeed, in the sense that sometimes the term ontology and metaphysics is used, that makes no sense. Dooyeweerd rejects metaphysics because it tries to go beyond our temporal reality. And I don't know if Dooyeweerd himself did, but some of his students do. They take the term ontology also in the sense of an analysis, a theory of being, which is kind of something being behind what we experience. And his whole philosophy is directed against that. Yeah, but that is right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Another one. Or would you like a second question? Okay.
No, thank you.
Kees.
Yeah, a question about the several models. You gave a bright outline of it, and one element of it is the sovereignty in the own sphere, which suggests that there are several borders between the several models. Well, I've read some other contributions to the development of technology, and what they say is there are no pre-giving borders, but they are fuzzy. And they are using the metaphor of a seamless web of society. They took, for example, a railway station. They say it is not especially the outcome of an engineer or of an economic behavior, but it is part of a whole society, which is, in essence, existing of several aspects which forms a seamless web. So how would you react to that metaphor?
let me make a few remarks, and then maybe you come back with your question. Part of my hesitation is that your remark refers to concrete things that are technically constructed. And although I have mentioned some things that relate to that, basically to answer your question, I first have to go into the theory of entities as an addition to the theory of modes of being, as I did. But there is at least one thing that I can say now, and that is that your last remark that that things will go seen without separation together. Dooyeweerd would totally agree with that. And that refers to what I said, that the analysis of modes of being, modes of experience, is a theoretical one. In reality, Dooyeweerd would say, they don't exist separately. So we don't experience them that way either. It's an abstract analysis of modes of being, and we can try to conceptualize that and analyze the relationships. But in Dooyeweerd's view, we can only do so because we abstract from the concrete coherence in reality which they exist, which is not the coherence I talked about, because that was the coherence we can analyze theoretically. But the coherence you mentioned, you would say that's the way they are there in reality, the way we experience them. This, of course, is not the whole answer, because still it might be worthwhile, but that anticipates what I'm going to say tomorrow night. So I won't go too deeply into that. We can get back to that maybe tomorrow night. But he would say still we can analyze the way certain aspects, analyze in a theoretical way, the way certain aspects apply, and the way certain aspects are cohering, what is most typical, what is most characteristic. And then without denying that in reality, they are not separated or added up, but cohere, that for a theoretical understanding, the distinction of the different modes of experience, the different aspects, might still be fruitful to get sight of specific differences.
You're satisfied? Thank you. Another question. Veronica.
I didn't quite understand why you differentiated between cause and effect. Could you re-explain that? Where does that come into Dooyeweerd's argument?
The whole context of it was that there is not only diversity between the aspects, but also coherence. And the way Dooyeweerd analyzes that coherence. And that is that within one aspect you find references to other aspects. Now I took one illustration that Dooyeweerd has worked out, but not in detail. He has worked it out for the field of law, his own field. But where you can illustrate the meaning both of the coherence and the distinction. That certain concepts are not used only in one field, but also in other fields. But that doesn't mean that the concepts are used in precisely the same way. So cause and effect, or cause, just take the term causes, they have a specific meaning in physics. But they also have a meaning in the field of law. The judges could not have somebody judge and made guilty if he couldn't say that there is a legal cause behind a certain event that can be, how do you say that? Now that a certain person is made responsible, that because in a sense he is legally the cause of a certain event. So that concept is used in the field of law. And it's a problem in the philosophy of law. In which sense can we explain the term cause here without giving it a physical meaning, which would mean that it's deterministic. And so the term cause, you could say, shows that if cause is originally something of the physical sphere, then it comes back as a concept in other fields. In the field of history, in the field of law, in logic as ground. But then there is not only a similarity, there is also a difference, a distinction. And so to understand the specific use of the term cause in those other fields, you should not take them in the sense of cause as it is taken in physics. At the same time, there is an awareness that there is some relationship, that it's not just arbitrary to use that word, that the term analogical concept is a very old philosophical term. And in his system, he uses the diversity and the irreducibility to explain, but at the same time as an element that shows that there is coherence between the different aspects. So they are not just separated, they also cohere. There's a specific order between them. And by that he tries to explain the way specific concepts are used in different sciences, where he can account for the coherence between those concepts and for the differences between them.
Can I follow on this subject?
You can go on, of course.
On this sort of, can this deterministic assumption coexist with the teleological hypothesis or assumption? For example, in the psychological domain or something other. Let's say I am opening this door in order to enter the room instead of I have entered the room because the door was open. How would the Dooyeweerd see himself?
Now, as I said, Dooyeweerd has not worked this out in detail, but I think myself that in psychology, the cause-effect relationship has an intentional moment. If you just said, I intended something and with that act, so there is that intentional element. That doesn't mean that there is not also a physical cause and effect relationship, but the intentional element, which is not only there in humans, but also in some animals, you know, the intentional behavior, which is also typically related to consciousness, intentionality. You know, so there I think the cause and effect relationship in the field of psychology has that intentional element.
So they can coexist in a way. Because for me, this gives me the possibility to normativity in the upper modalities.
Is that fine?
Yeah.
Another person. Ben.
First a question, if I have understood it well enough. You said of the modalities that they are in principle universally. That is to say that any object you can think of is either subject in a modality or is object in another of all the modalities. And if it is not actual object in say, an economic modality, it is potentially. And that this is in its totality the essence or the characteristic of all being. That something is only fully understood within its relations. That is well understood. Isn't that very anthropocentric to say that anything that is existing is only complete within its functions, its relations to human activities, activities that only a human being can be subject in. We, in our society, we are used to think in economic terms, and that we even have the air above a country is owned by that country, even if the air itself is blowing all around the world. We have divided even the sea in human possessions. Other people say, for example, that no animal can be owned by any human being, because an animal is not the kind of thing that can be owned. And the same for the trees and the air and clear water. That is a different way to look at man in this world. Isn't this view on reality from Dooyeweerd very Western, within a certain tradition that is only found in this age, in this part of the world? In addition, I think of the world as God created, as the Bible says. Man was only created after a lot of other existing things and beings. Does it mean that all these existing things on the third day did not have found their destination because man wasn't there? So all the relations that is part of the essence of all these beings wasn't there yet. Can you respond to that?
Interesting.
Yeah, but there are a few things that I want to say, but maybe I forgot some. Let me start with your reference to Genesis, because the way I understand Genesis 1 and 2, how different they are, is that they rather support not the philosophical side of Dooyeweerd's approach. It would be crazy to project that into Genesis, but the important place of humankind and that creation is very much related to humankind, because it's not for nothing that Genesis 1 is usually read as leading up to the creation of man as we make the image of God. And if explicitly it is stated that the sun and the moon and the stars are there to be lights on the day and the night and to regulate the periods in time, etc. And in Genesis 2, in a different perspective, I think, the garden is created around man and the animals are created and brought to man to be named. So in the biblical approach, again, not in the sense of Dooyeweerd's philosophy, but without saying that the biblical view of creation is anthropocentric, because it's, in a sense it's theocentric, but the human person has an important place there, a unique place. That's the first remark. The second remark is that I do think that this theory does account for the way things exist. That things do not exist in themselves, but in relationships. And that's how we experience them. And philosophical theory should account for that. Over against the philosophical approach from the Greeks or modern times that isolates something in itself as kind of often an intellectual thing, or nowadays a physical thing in itself. In that respect, I do think that Dooyeweerd's theory is doing much more justice to reality as we experience it, and also reality as the Bible speaks about it, than the other theories. I do agree that we have to be careful here. I mentioned as one precaution that we should not claim that the modes of experience are exhaustive for creative reality. But I would also agree that if we would say that things only are fully part of created reality if somehow the relationship to the human person is developed, then I think we claim too much. That would also overstate this theory. So if I say potentially, then I don't mean that the goal should be that all potentials are realized. And I think I'm more careful there for myself than Dooyeweerd used to be. At the same time, we should be careful not to interpret those, say, subject-object relationships only in their actuality as they are, and now not over against potential, but over against normativity. I haven't said much about that side. For myself, the theory of the modal aspects, I don't think that I differ from Dooyeweerd there, though maybe I emphasize it more than he did. But it's not only a theoretical instrument to account for diversity in reality, but also to make us sensitive for the brokenness of reality in this diversity. So the normativity is very crucial to understand them. And in relation to the economic, I do not think that if things function in economic subject-object relationship in relation to the human person, that that's necessarily negative. It might indeed be an opening up, but it doesn't mean that in actuality, where the relationship is actualized, it's always an opening up. You know, it might also be somehow a closing up. So the brokenness of reality, a dimension which I hardly mentioned, that certainly is a basic dimension in applying this theory to reality. That it should not only make us sensitive to the diversity, but also to the brokenness that is there. So that the normativity is important. I could have mentioned, say, the aesthetic subject-object relationship, or the mystical creedal subject-object relationship, and then there are also the good possibility and the bad possibility. Say, in the creedal we can praise the Creator for his creatures, and so then in a way the creation gets its voice to praise the Creator through the human person. Of course, we can also absolutize the creatures in our faith, in the way that we look at them. And there it's not in praise of the Creator, but it's absolutizing the creatures. The aesthetic could be the same. What I wanted to emphasize, and maybe I should have used first the illustration of the aesthetic, that beauty is not something that we subjectively project on reality, but that in reality things are neutral, and that beauty, such kind of things, are just something that we subjectively project on them. Now that beauty is really something of reality, although the appraisal of that, as far as we know in our human existence, I'm not saying that God is dependent on us for that, or even the angels, I don't know. But the appraisal of that in our experience and the way we live in reality goes through the human being. And there might be an opening up of reality, and there might be a closing up. So, again, I agree that potential does not mean the potential that every place needs to be actualized. But still, I think, where it is opening up, where relationships are opened up, that is something positive. But the positive side can very much be negatively filled. Maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yes, thank you. Is it fine?
Yes.
Thank you. There's still time for other questions, so if you like to raise another point, it's possible. Yes, Derek.
No one else, I can entirely entertain. I am a little bit curious about this your perhaps speculations. Recently there have been an addition to the modal there with a so-called epistemological modal. And I'm curious why, because Dooyeweerd did lots of work in philosophy, and why did he not himself establish an epistemic modality? What would you speculate? What's the reason? Was it the time of his work, or the character of the modalities, or?
Well, Dooyeweerd himself did not so much emphasize the difference between thinking, thought and knowledge. Vollenhoven did, who worked together with Dooyeweerd in developing this theory, and the student of Dooyeweerd, Mekker, did very much so also. But I think both was in line with Dooyeweerd himself, and the reason, I think, is not that they tended to have, next to the logical mode, or the analytical mode, an epistemic mode, a mode of knowledge, but that knowledge as such is not a mode of being. You could say, but now I formulate it, I phrase it in my own words, knowledge is the result of experience. And that means that there are different types of knowledge. There is knowledge that is characterized by sense experience. There is knowledge that is characterized by logical analysis. There is knowledge that is characterized by love, the ethical relationship. There is knowledge that is characterized by faith. And then, of course, all the other aspects will also function there. So characterized by doesn't mean that it's only that. So there are different kinds of knowledge. And characterized by different modes of experience. And if that's the case, of course, there is no place for the typical mode of knowledge. And the distinction between different kinds, differently characterized types of knowledge is certainly there. So knowledge is rather the result of the different modes of experience. There is legal knowledge, there is moral knowledge.
It was more or less what I suspected. Thank you.
Okay. Any other one? We have still 3 minutes and then we have to stop.
I have a little one. You talked about the occult for a moment, about demons, angels. And a few weeks ago I exactly heard that argument against Dooyeweerd. Someone was saying Dooyeweerd only talks about the visible reality, and there's no room in it for the spiritual world, and therefore the person calls Dooyeweerd's approach unbiblical. But would you say, but when someone is saying that to you, what would you like to comment?
Well, basically what I said already, that if the theory of modalities is taken as an exhaustive one, then he would be right. Not that by that the whole theory is unbiblical, but that it does claim too much. I don't think that Dooyeweerd really wanted to exclude the reality of, say, the spiritual world at all. In one of his interviews, he speaks about the reality of demonic forces. So I don't think that he intended to be exhaustive there. But from his theoretical analysis, and very much it relates to different fields of research. The theory of modes is very much related to different fields of research, scientific research, scholarly research. And being in discussion with other philosophical approaches, and being in discussion with an approach in terms of nature, which is existing by itself, and grace, which is then specifically the field where God interacts, and rejecting that because he felt that then that doesn't do justice to the creation, where God is immanent as transcendent at the same time. It doesn't do justice to the world as creation if you make that distinction, nature by its own laws, and then grace where God interacts in a specific way. But I don't know if he ever dealt with this problem as such. I don't think he did. So my response would be that we have to leave openings in this modal analysis for modes of being that we cannot theoretically analyze. Maybe at some point we could, I don't know. But my suggestion, the implication of what I say is not that we should add a mode of being that accounts for what is characteristic for angels and demonic.
But we have to place angels and demonics in the same reality as in which the modal aspects are. We can localize different modal aspects.
I think that it makes only sense to speak of the other creatures if they do interact with our world. And so I'm open to that.
Yeah.
And they are part of created reality, of which we are part too. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can fit them in our theoretical framework.
Yes.
We need such a framework that it is open to them, but it doesn't mean that we can integrate them in it.
This belongs to our domain of experience in principle.
Yes. Well, if yes, in the sense that I don't think that human beings need something extra to experience them, as some people have had and have those experiences. But not in the sense that everybody in principle experiences them. And that is just that we close ourselves off. You know, I can't say that, but that's the case. So I don't think that there is something typically. It might be part in relation to the occult that people open themselves up to them and get caught into it. That, and I know, I haven't studied them, but I know that there are some studies about the occult, also in a systematic way. But that doesn't mean that in a theoretical framework you can place kind of mode somewhere that fits in the whole scheme with, you know, the coherence and that. At this moment, it doesn't make sense to me. And for me, it means even with a fruitful system, we should be modest and not claim that we can explain everything. That doesn't mean that you can explain nothing. It's very fruitful in many respects, but it doesn't mean that it's applicable everywhere. But there is no reason to believe that in principle we as human creatures have to be able to explain everything.
I think that will be a good final word for tonight, because we have to explain more tomorrow night. Thank you for so far, and I would say till tomorrow.
Yes. Thank you.